And welcome back to another edition of the I Prefer the 80s and 90s Sports podcast where I talk about the world of sports and why I talk about why I prefer the sports of the 80s and 90s over today. Today's topic, college football. College football in the 80s and 90s was fun. It was fun because the unknowns. It was fun because who was announcing the games. It was fun because rivalries meant something. It was fun because it was about the game, not about the business of the game. College football kicked off 2 weeks ago with some games that had some intrigue. They weren't games in which the teams that were highly ranked were going to be threatened in, and they weren't. Week 2 of college football, everyone got back into the games, and we are off and running. Some conferences look spectacular. Some conferences got a lot to prove, got a lot of questions that need to be answered. Because of the way the media is today and because of the way the games are today, there's so much time and energy spent on talking about the games, talking about the teams before we see them play. Many people in the field of college football believe that preseason rankings are useless because we don't know what these teams look like, because in college football, unlike in the NFL, there's no preseason, there's no practice games against other opponents. It's just you practicing against your team and you doing what you do and hoping that that translates on opening night or opening day for your team. The thing that makes me insane about this era of college football is early prognostications and early discussions about teams that don't really play anybody. Or the funny thing about college athletics is this new thing called the transfer portal, where kids are now able to go to any college they want to, if the school wants them, after participating in college sports. Kids also today are getting paid for their names and their image and their likeness, which factors into, in some cases, where some kids decide to transfer to. In the 80s and 90s, we are aware that college football players, college basketball players, baseball players, lacrosse players, some of them got impermissible benefits and some of them lost eligibility. Some of them created such a scandal because they got money. A school like SMU was put on the death penalty because of how crazy it was. Now all that stuff is legal. But I want to talk about that. I prefer the 80s and 90s football and college football because the UPI and the AP determined, and the coaches poll determined who were ranked, who was number one, and they pretty much, most years, got it right. Were there times where the polls were wrong because they favored certain teams? Abso-freaking-lutely. Ask West Virginia. West Virginia beat the team that beat the team. Remember that speech the coach gave, Don Nehlen said, "We beat the team that beat the team. We should be playing in the game." And they didn't get a chance to play in the game. They watched Florida State play Florida because of Notre Dame. I don't know. It got messed up. And thus, the beginning of the BCS, which people call the BS, because some of the teams are ranked higher than teams that people believed couldn't beat them. And then we got bad matchups in championship games. We got good matchups. We got shocking results. I mean, the first ever BCS championship game, Florida State, Tennessee. Tennessee was good, but most people thought that Florida State would steamroll them. Didn't happen. Then we got the next few years later, we got Florida State with the Heisman Trophy winner against Oklahoma, and Oklahoma won 13-2. People thought the system didn't work. People felt that what turned it all around was the USC Texas game, where two teams unbeaten got down, played it. Texas won in an epic game. Obviously, there was a year before that where USC played Oklahoma, smashed Oklahoma, but LSU people feel that they were the best team in the country, and therefore they don't believe it should be a split championship. It should be a championship for them because they felt they were better than USC, but they didn't get a chance to prove it. So they create this system, and this is what we got. But see, the problem is that in college football, you can't live in the past unless a team brings back the majority of its players from a year ago or brings back key players from the previous season. This past Saturday, TCU, Texas Christian University, took on Colorado, and everyone in the world felt that TCU would steamroll Colorado because TCU played in the championship game last year. Not looking at TCU's roster, not looking at Colorado's roster, not looking and knowing what Colorado's roster was going to present, and also not knowing what TCU's, the bookies made TCU a 20-point favorite. And everyone in the country said this is going to be a blowout. Deion Sanders' team was going to be embarrassed. And the opposite happened. TCU was undressed because they were not as good as last year. They did not have the quarterback from last year, the running back from last year, the defensive back who won the Thorpe Award last year, the receiver that was drafted in the first round to the San Diego Chargers from last year, the defensive tackles, the linebacker. They didn't have the same team. But everybody now is Colorado is the baddest team on the planet because they beat a team that beat Michigan in the semifinals and got their brakes beaten off by Georgia in the championship game. But they made it to the championship game. In fact, that's the other fact that people ain't talking about. Yeah, TCU made it to the championship game, but they got their butts stomped on in the championship game by Georgia, by a more athletic, bigger, faster, stronger team. And so preseason rankings don't mean spit today because we don't know what we're going to see. Now, Georgia, Alabama, Ohio State all come back with brand new quarterbacks. Some years, the brand new quarterback is good. Some years, the brand new quarterback ain't spit. I'll give you a perfect example. Last night, Clemson. Clemson last year won 10 games as they've done 11 straight years, which is either tied for the record or is the record for most consecutive years with Alabama of winning 10 straight games. 10 games, excuse me. And they brought back a quarterback, which made another quarterback transfer schools because he was the guy for 2 years, and they made him transfer schools basically because he lost his job to this quarterback, And he came back, but he didn't come back with the same weapons that the quarterback, the previous one, had. And they lose to Duke, of all schools, last night. So sometimes coming back with the quarterback because people in the media think that they're going to be good isn't a recipe for success. The greatest illustration of that happened in 2004. When USC had just had Carson Palmer draft number 1 by the Bengals. I think it was earlier than that. It was 2003. Had Carson Palmer drafted. The next year, they were starting a quarterback that very few people have heard of named Matt Leinart. And their first game was against Auburn University in Auburn. And Auburn was coming back with Cadillac and Ronnie Barham. And Auburn was supposed to run all over USC because USC was bringing back a quarterback that no one had ever heard of, had potential, but no one ever knew that. And this game was supposed to be ugly. And it was ugly. It was ugly for Auburn as USC embarrassed them 23-7 and went on that year to win the national championship. So it's not an exact science predicting the preseason. They have to rank teams because for the bookies and for the fans. But the fact of the matter is, a lot of times they're not right. But back in the 80s and 90s, they were right. In the 80s and 90s, we had weird champions because they allowed it to work itself out. Georgia Tech won a national championship in college football. Now, they were co-champions with Colorado, but they won the championship because they were unbeaten. BYU won a national championship. What could you say? They won the championship. Could they win the championship today? The only way BYU would win the championship today is obviously they got to the playoffs and they won all the playoff games. But back in the 80s and 90s, it was voted a voting system, and usually the voting system was correct. But I still vividly remember Nebraska playing Tennessee or playing in a bowl game, and they were undefeated, and Michigan was undefeated, and Michigan got to play Washington State, and Nebraska played somebody in a bowl game. I think it was Tennessee or Florida, and they absolutely annihilated them. And I remember before the games, Scott Frost sitting there saying, ask Michigan if they want to play us. And Michigan players probably said, yeah, they would, but that Nebraska team was special. So what's my point? My point is they play the games out on the field. Stop scheduling cupcakes and let's see who you are before everybody runs to the voting machines, runs through and to the TV microphones and TV sets and starts talking about how great one team is and how great one team isn't. Let us see it first. Yeah, in the 80s and 90s, we didn't see it first. They just came out. We didn't know anything about Herschel. We didn't know anything about Bo. We didn't know anything about Dud Flutie. We didn't know anything about Hugh Green. We didn't know things about some of the great players. I already told you, Matt Leinart, Reggie Bush. We didn't know things about players till they played. So let them play first before y'all jump on anyone's bandwagon. This week, Texas is playing Alabama. What people don't talk about the game last year is everyone only talks about the Texas quarterback got hurt and they kept the game close and the backup quarterback actually played pretty well too, but they still lost by 1 point because the best player in college football, Bryce Young, played like that Heisman winner. And he would have won the Heisman last year if their kicker makes the field goal against Tennessee and they lost to LSU on the last play of the game, overtime drive type thing. Should have gotten more consideration than he did, but I'm happy with the USC kid winning because I root for USC too. But my point simply is, in that Alabama game last year, Alabama's running back got hurt. And so it took Alabama a quarter or two to figure out how to adjust and then finally decide that Bryce was the way to go. And then they won. Again, let the games play out on the field. For some reason, playing in college stadiums is intimidating. The noise of the crowd. Even though the noise of your crowd of 100,000 people is good for you. Let them play the games first, and let's see what happens. In the 80s and 90s, yeah, there was controversy. Yes, it wasn't an exact science. Today is not exact science either, and they're trying to rectify it by having a playoffs. They need to make everybody more eligible, but they don't. Because if San Diego State goes undefeated, San Diego State may not get into the top 12, may not get into the top 8. Because other teams that might be better on paper, or might be better because they play better competition, are ahead of them. Stupid, but that's the way it is. Boise State, when they were rocking and rolling, they never got the love they deserve. So, play the games on the field before we start ranking Ronnie, Bobby, Ricky, and Mike. And let's enjoy college football. Can you imagine if Colorado loses to Nebraska this week?